Oh my, who could have seen this coming? Yes, for anybody who hasn't been paying attention, we've finally arrived at part 4 of our 4-part series so far. We began by taking a look at the devil, progressing to talk about demons, moving our way over to angels, which was a lot more fun to talk about, and we finally come full circle with a video on God. Now, naturally, God is a very complicated topic, and there's a lot of different ways that we can approach that question. Now, if we want to talk about God as an abstract or a philosophical concept, then a lot of different people coming from a lot of different backgrounds can actually find a lot of common ground together, and that's fantastic. But what I want to focus on today is the God of Christianity. And this isn't a God who's just out there somewhere floating in space, or more accurately, beyond space, but rather this is a being who has interacted with humankind through history. And as Christians, we believe that there's records of these interactions preserved in the Holy Scriptures themselves. So rather than focusing on philosophical and theological minutiae, important though they may be, I want to focus more on how God is portrayed and is understood in the Old Testament of the Bible specifically. Obviously, the whole Bible is important. I'm going to get into some of the New Testament materials, but I'm primarily focusing on the Old Testament because that sets the stage and establishes the foundation for everything else that comes after it. On top of that, too, a lot of the theology of the Old Testament is really difficult to access for people today. Most of us can read the New Testament and have a pretty good idea of what's going on there. But the Old Testament, because it comes from such a different culture and such a different time, remains very obscure to a lot of people. So hopefully we can shine some light on that today and take a look and see what we can find there. It's important to understand that the people of the Bible, that's to say the people who are depicted in the Bible, like King David and the prophet Jeremiah, as well as the people who would later write the books of the Bible, like the scribes of the Deuteronomistic school and Jeremiah's scribe Baruch, all of these people were people who inhabited the ancient world, specifically in the late Bronze and early Iron Age in the ancient Near East. And as a result, because they lived in that world, they thought like people in that world did. Oftentimes, when we come to a difficult to understand text in the Old Testament, the reason we have a hard time accessing it is because we don't have the same cultural context as people back then did who wrote the Bible and who read it and who understood what was being spoken of here. Whereas we moderns, especially in the West, really don't have a whole lot of contact with those ideas. A great example of this is the book of Leviticus. When is the last time you read Leviticus for devotional? It's something that they would have understood back then, the concept of ritual purity, the importance of holy ground, things of that nature that we really don't have any modern equivalents of. And so because there's things like that, if we can start thinking like the ancients, and when we read the Bible having adopted that mindset, things start to open up a lot more. This isn't to say that you need this sort of mindset to get anything out of the Old Testament or the Bible as a whole, but once you start thinking like the ancients did, then you start to see what they were trying to get at with their literature. And it's because people lived in the ancient world that they depict God in the way that an ancient living in that time period would depict a general deity. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a different portrait than what we understand today, and even from what we understand in the New Testament period. And this is a cause of concern for some people. If God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, why would depictions of him change over time? But God doesn't change. He's always the same, yesterday, today, and forever. But people do change. And as ancient Israel went through different cultural movements and cultural evolutions over time, as they went from wanderers in the wilderness to the people who occupied an Iron Age kingdom, to people who were living in exile in a foreign land, different things were important to their lives, and God's roles in different aspects of their life became more or less important depending on where they are. Take agriculture, for instance. So we find a lot of different texts in the Old Testament that speak of God being the one who provides the rain for the agricultural produce of the nation of Israel. So all the farmers in Israel relied on God, the God of Israel, to provide them with their rain through the water cycle. But this wouldn't have been important at the time when they were wandering through the wilderness, when they didn't have any agriculture, when they were herding goats and other sorts of farm animals. And yet when they come to settle into the land, all of a sudden, this thing that was never really important to them before, the issue of rain, becomes vitally important. Because if there's no rain, there's no crops. If there's no crops, there's no food. And there goes not only your food source, but also your entire economy. Likewise, when Israel was living in exile in Babylon and they weren't the owners of their own estates, agriculture would have been less important. So it's interesting that God would have been seen as having an agricultural function during the time that Israel was its own nation, but not before and probably not very much afterwards. So God doesn't change, but the things people need, the things that people see as important, and the things that people talk to God about do change. And that's what I'm talking about with people changing. They're adjusting their expectations and their needs over time, and that's reflected in the biblical record itself. Religion didn't look the same for the Israelites during the time of Moses as it did during the time of David, as it did during the time of Ezra, as it did during the time of Jesus, and everything that followed after that. Just because there's development doesn't mean that God is changing. It's people who change. So when we look at the depiction of God in the Old Testament, we shouldn't really expect to find that God is depicted in the Old Testament the same way he is in the New Testament, or even in the church today. To be sure, we worship the same God. There's continuity all the way through, and there are some elements that don't ever change. But what we're seeing is that depending on the cultural moments that a particular culture is in, that a particular writer is in, the way they're looking at God is going to change a little bit. And since the Old Testament texts were written by people who were living in the late Bronze Age and throughout the Iron Age, we would expect to see God represented in a way that a deity would be in the Iron Age and in the late Bronze Age. And so there's a lot of benefit to looking at how people thought of the divine realm, how people, even from other cultures, thought about gods and the divine and the things associated with them to help us understand how the Israelites might have understood their own God. Certainly, the Israelites had a lot of unique features, and those unique features are very important. Again, most of those unique features are the through lines that run all the way up to the present day. But at the same time, there's a lot of features that they share in common with the people around them at the time. And so that can shed some light on how ancient Israelites thought about religion and thought about God. So to sum all that up, people in the ancient world thought about God the way that they would have thought about God in the ancient world. But that being said, there are through lines through the modern day today. So without further ado, let's take a look at how the ancient Israelites viewed God and see what we can learn from that. Two quick notes before we begin. First of all, because we're talking about God, this topic is almost infinitely complex, so we're not going to cover every single thing here. But I do want to be fairly comprehensive and take a look at how God was understood in the Old Testament period as a God. Secondly, I'm going to be referring to God throughout this video as Yahweh. I've got a whole video on the names of God that's planning to be coming out relatively soon. But it seems that generally the name Yahweh is associated most closely with the God of Israel and the God of modern-day Jews and Christians alike. Records of the worship of Yahweh go back to around 1250 BC. Now, for context, we have written literature on the religious worldview of the ancients going back to as far as 3000 BC. So, in this whole scope of history, the worship of Yahweh shows up pretty late. And for a lot of Christians and Orthodox Jews and anybody else who believes a biblical story, this seems kind of weird. If God is the creator of all things, if he created humankind, then why don't we find worship of him in the earliest time? Shouldn't we see everybody worshiping God at an early time and then slipping away into paganism later? Well, actually, according to the Bible itself, no. What's interesting is that in the Old Testament, in those primordial stories of the oldest times, from Cain and Abel through the flood of Noah, God doesn't seem to interact with people all that much. And so it seems that most people were left to their own devices for finding or inventing gods of their own. And when God does appear and interact with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the time period leading up to the Exodus, he doesn't call himself Yahweh. He refers to himself as El. El was the generic term in a lot of Northwest Semitic languages for God. It's kind of like our word God today. It's just kind of like, it's not a proper name. It's just the word God, right? So he doesn't seem to disclose his identity specifically to the patriarchs. In fact, the name Yahweh, God's proper chosen name for himself, doesn't actually show up in the biblical narrative until the Exodus of Moses. In the story of the burning bush, the first time that Moses is introduced to God, Moses approaches the burning bush and is told by God that God had revealed himself to Moses and the Israelites' ancestors as El Shaddai, which means something like God Most High or God Almighty. But he's going to reveal himself to Moses and to the Israelites as Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. The proper name that God gives himself, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, means I am that which I am. But if you wanted to say he is, abstractly, it would be Yahweh, something along those lines anyways. So it seems that the worship of Yahweh specifically, at least by that name, didn't really begin until the Exodus of Moses, according to Israelite sources themselves. Now that being said, there have been a couple false positives along the way of archaeologists and scholars who think they have found references to Yahweh in substantially older sources. So for instance, when the city of Ebla was first uncovered, which dates to around 2500 BC, so very, very old in the whole scope of everything. Some scholars who were involved in the dig thought that they found the name Yahweh in certain tablets there, but as more and more research has come out and as the language of Ebla has been deciphered to further and further extents, nobody really holds to that theory anymore. It's pretty much a moot point. Likewise, there are some slightly earlier Egyptian references, I believe 14th century BC, so 1300s, 100 years before Moses, give or take, which refer to the Shasu of Yahu, and some scholars have taken Yahu to be an Egyptianized form of the name Yahweh. So this is a reference to nomadic sheep herders in the vicinity of Iron Age, Edom, which would be directly south of Israel. But the identification of the word Yahu with Yahweh is disputed. Some argue that it is a reference to the god of that land, whereas other Egyptologists believe that it's a reference to the land itself. The land is called Yahu. And honestly, from what little I've seen, coming from a non-specialist Egyptologist, it does seem that it's a reference to the land and not to the deity associated with the land. Could be wrong about that one, but if I am, then it just seems to be the fact that the Edomites were also involved in the worship of Yahweh around the same time as the Israelites. And that would be particularly disturbing because the Edomites, according to the Israelites themselves, are their first cousins, essentially. That's to say that the Israelites see themselves as the descendants of the patriarch Jacob, and the Edomites are the descendants of the patriarch Jacob's brother Esau. So, very closely related. If they did worship Yahweh, it wouldn't be the weirdest thing in the whole world, but again, the evidence is inconclusive at best and seemingly negative at worst. So Yahweh just sort of explodes onto the scene, ostensibly out of nowhere. Now, what's also interesting, which Michael Hundley points out, is the fact that Yahweh appears on the scene without a genealogy. That seems normal to us, because why would God be related to anybody? He's the infinite God who's always existed, and he's the source of everything else, and so he wouldn't have any family members. But the way that the ancients thought of gods was basically a projection of the human realm into the divine realm. And so the ancient gods in the minds of the Canaanites and the Ammonites and the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, their gods ate and drank and slept and sometimes died. Not very frequently, but it has been known to happen. And they had families too, the old-fashioned way. And so it would be really weird to find a god without family members. A good example of this is Baal from the Phoenician and Canaanite pantheon. Baal is a name that many of us familiar with the Bible are familiar with. And Baal has a family. He has a sister named Anat. He has a father named El, or Dagon, depending on which source you ask. And there's all the other gods of the pantheons likewise have relatives that way. So it's really weird that not only does Yahweh just sort of pop into the historical record out of nowhere, he's not mentioned as having a father and a mother, a spouse, we'll talk about that, any children or offspring, at least not in the biological sense. So it's interesting that he just sort of pops in and doesn't have a genealogy or a record. This isn't to say that that's unheard of by ancient standards, but for gods that lack genealogies or family members, usually it's in deities that occur like once or twice in the inscriptional evidence, and we just don't have enough data to know who they might be related to. You know, in the minds of the ancients, those minor gods that we don't have any references to the family of may have been family members of so-and-so or such and such, and we just don't have any references to that provided. It's really weird to find a god who specifically doesn't have a genealogy and who's mentioned in a lot of texts. One would imagine that if Yahweh was believed to have a family, then we would know about it. But it seems that he doesn't, and so we don't. It's also interesting to look at the relationship between Yahweh and the creation of the world. Now, it wasn't totally uncommon to depict the gods of old as being the people responsible for either creating the universe or putting it into its current fashion, essentially. So in some myths, they literally seem to create it, not out of nothing, but virtually out of nothing. It's not quite the same thing, but it's close. And in other ancient myths, it's more like they're taking the pre-existing matter of the world and they're ordering it into its proper allotments. Like, okay, all the water goes over there in the ocean, all the land goes over here on dry land, we'll put some mountains there, things of that nature. So it's not uncommon to see the gods engage in that sort of thing. But what is weird is the difference between how Yahweh creates and how most of the other cosmogonies happen. So essentially, what we find really frequently in the ancient world is something called the Chaoskampf. It's a German word if you couldn't tell. And Chaoskampf basically refers to the fact that in most ancient myths on the origin of the world, it starts out as a battle between the gods on the one hand and the monsters of chaos on the other. The big example of this is the Babylonian creation story, the Enuma Elish. And this depicts how, at first, at the very primordial stage, there were two chaos serpents named Apsu and Tiamat. Yeah, it's a great time to run out of battery. So monsters, right? We'll do a whole video on the Enuma Elish at a later time, but basically you have the two dragons of chaos, right? So Apsu represents the freshwater system and Tiamat represents the saltwater system, basically. And then you have the Council of the Gods. And the gods and the chaos monsters don't get along very well. So the gods set out to defeat the chaos monsters, and when they do, they actually build the world out of the corpses of the chaos monsters. It is metal as heck. But what's interesting is that there's combat going on here. There's sort of this primordial combat, and again, the world is made out of the corpses of these monsters, basically. So there's a struggle that's going on here that's fundamental to the creation story. What's interesting is that when Yahweh appears on the scene, he doesn't seem to do battle with any particular monsters of chaos. Now, there are stories about Yahweh defeating the manifestations of chaos in draconic form. Those certainly do exist in Isaiah and in the Psalms and elsewhere, but it seems that the fundamental creation story of the Israelites, when they wanted to know, how did God go about creating things, is found in Genesis 1. And in that story, which a lot of us know, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and the 7 days that follow that, God isn't doing combat with the forces of chaos. It's more like a potter molding clay into its proper form. So he's sort of the uncontested shaper of the world rather than one who has to struggle against chaos to form it properly. Now, I should note that it certainly wasn't universal for ancient cosmogonies to depict a chaos comp situation. I think a lot of times scholarship sort of overemphasizes how common that was. Certainly it was very important and it was somewhat common, but it's not every culture and every civilization that had this struggle of, good and evil, order and chaos at the creation of the world. But it still did show up quite frequently. Speaking of creation, it's also really interesting to look at the role and the relationship between God and nature. In most ancient myths of the deities creating the various functions of the world, whether it's the motion of the sun, the erection of mountains, the flowing of streams, things of that nature, we find that when these things are done, there's a particular god that's given control and association with that particular thing. The Babylonian god of the sun, Shamash, was associated with the sun. It was his job to carry the sun through the sky, down below the earth, through the underworld, and back up again. Likewise, various gods of rivers were responsible for ensuring that the rivers flowed properly. And in some sense, the sun itself was bound up with the nature of Shamash. The river gods were bound up with the nature of the river. If you affect or harm one of those things, you affect or harm the god in some sense. And it's really interesting that when we come to Yahweh and his relationship to nature, he's not particularly associated with any particular object in nature itself. Now, he certainly created these things, and he certainly has control over these things, and the Israelites use the symbolism of a lot of these things, especially storm clouds in the agrarian phase, to depict Yahweh and to talk about how grand he was. But it doesn't seem that Yahweh's nature itself was bound up with any particular object in the natural world itself. Now, again, that's not completely unheard of, but it is rather rare. For most of these deities who have exceptions, that's to say deities who aren't bound up with an object in nature, the majority of these exceptions are national deities. So a national deity is a deity who sort of represents the nation's interests that it corresponds to. So for instance, the Edomites had a national deity named Kus, the Moabites had a national deity named Shamash, and the Assyrians had a national deity named Ashur. For the Babylonians it was Marduk, and the list goes on and on. So for the Israelites, Yahweh did stand in the role of a national god. But again, there's an important distinction to be made here. Let me give you an example of what a national god in operation might look like, then I'll contrast with the Israelite perspective in a minute here. So one national god of the ancient world was Ashur. Ashur was the national god of Assyria. In fact, the word Assyria is a derivation of the word Ashur. It's complicated, just go with it. The Neo-Assyrian period marked a very aggressive period of expansion for the Neo-Assyrian Empire. They were consuming territory like nobody's business. And basically the philosophy of the Neo-Assyrians was that Ashur had determined the way that all human beings were supposed to live. And so all land is Ashur's land, all people are supposed to live as Ashur intended. And so when the Neo-Assyrians were expanding, they didn't see it as conquest. They saw it as civilizing barbarians into the way that the gods intended for them to live. It was a very aggressive program. And very frequently throughout the conquests of Neo-Assyrian kings, especially in the reign of Ashurbanipal, we'd find a very common refrain. I'll use Ashurbanipal, the king of Assyria, as an example for this one. The refrain that we would see in inscriptions everywhere is Ashur is king and Ashurbanipal is his regent. And you'd insert the name of whatever king is currently alive at the time, of course. But the idea is that whatever the king is carrying out on earth is the will of the national deity Ashur. I suppose if the king had failed in his duty, it must not have been Ashur's intention. So as long as the king is able to achieve something, he seems to have Ashur's seal of approval. The point I'm trying to make here is that in a lot of cases, the national deity of any particular nation was bound up with the activities of the king. If the king was successful in what he set out to accomplish, then it would be seen as something that the national deity approved of. From a ground-up perspective, whatever the king can get away with is what the gods are okay with. Now, the way that Yahweh as the national God of Israel stands out is that the prophets of Yahweh were actually very, very critical of the monarchy throughout most of the monarchy's reign. That's to say, as long as there was a king in Israel ruling over God's people, a king that God himself had established and oftentimes anointed, the prophets, the mouthpiece of God, were telling the king, you're doing a terrible job. Like, the will of the nation is not the will of God. The will of the nation should be what God wants, but they're refusing to. So, in other words, the Israelites, or at least the Orthodox Yahwists, who were primarily represented by the prophets, didn't just take the deeds of the king and read them into the will of God. As to say, as long as there was a king in Israel ruling over God's people, God's mouthpiece, the prophets, were actively criticizing the king. So in Israel, because the prophets, the mouthpieces of God themselves, were arguing against the monarchy most of the time, and because the prophets generally had a lot of respect from most citizens in Israel, they couldn't just read whatever the king was doing into the will of God. There was allowed to be a disconnect between the two of them. I didn't have notes on any of that. We're getting off track. Okay, the point being that although God functioned as the national deity of the nation of Israel, the will of God and the will of the king were seen to be two separate things. Whereas for the most part of the ancient world, the will of God or the gods and the will of the king were seen to be totally aligned. So that's an important distinction to make. Now, taking a step back and going closer to what we were talking about a second ago, I want to talk a little bit more about the functions of Yahweh in ancient Israel. So, in the ancient world, a function was basically something that a deity was responsible for in the world around us. So, the sun god was responsible for moving the sun through the sky. The river gods were responsible for making sure that the river continued flowing. Fertility gods and goddesses were responsible for making sure that children were born to humans and offspring born to animals so that the next generation can continue. So, essentially, anything you can encounter in life, any phenomena in the natural world, any human experience you can have, any emotion you can encounter, there's a god assigned to that. And it takes a whole pantheon to make sure that every function of the universe, both on the social level and on the cosmic level, is being carried out properly. So why, if that's the case, if you need all these different gods to do all these different things, would Israel say, no, just one, but we're good with that? But they did. And as a result, the Israelites saw Yahweh as carrying out all the functions of the ancient world, which is a lot. Like, God was responsible for making sure the sun went through the sky, and making sure the moon went through the sky, and making sure the stars went through the sky, and making sure the rivers keep flowing, making sure the tide comes in, goes out of the Mediterranean. God was responsible for making sure that people had fertility. God was responsible for making sure that the land had fertility, so it would produce agriculture. God was responsible for the water cycle. Everything that took place in the cosmos around us or in social interactions, Yahweh was the God of in Israel, at least in ideal circumstances. And this is pretty impressive because although monotheism had been sort of tried before, it really hadn't found a whole lot of success. So, for instance, Akhenaten, one of the pharaohs of, I believe, the middle period of ancient Egypt, attempted to assimilate all the gods of Egypt into a single deity identified with the sun. But this fell apart only a generation after this. Apparently the Egyptian mind just wasn't ready for that dramatic of a change. Likewise, we have one example from ancient Babylon in something called the syncretistic Marduk hymn, where the author takes Marduk, the national god of Babylon, and attempts to identify all of the other gods, or at least a great many of them, as being just different names for the one god Marduk. But again, this doesn't seem to have been particularly popular in the ancient world. So although monotheism had been attempted, it really only found purchase in Israel. Although even then, the Israelites had trouble with monotheism. We find over and over in the biblical story that God's people, the people who were supposed to worship Yahweh alone, nevertheless had such a hard time with this. And I think the reason that they had such a hard time with that is because that's how the ancients thought. There was a deity for everything. It's so hard to think like, okay, so the God who makes the sun shine is also the God who makes the clouds come over and provides fertility and is our national God and is our family God. That's a lot of things to ascribe to one deity. And as we see from those other ancient examples, other attempts at monotheism didn't keep for a very long term. And so Israelites frequently fell away from worshiping Yahweh alone and worshiping other gods. That was the chief sin of the Israelites. It wasn't not worshiping Yahweh, it was worshiping Yahweh and other gods too. Nevertheless, according to the authors of the Bible and Orthodox adherents of Yahweh in ancient Israel, Yahweh did all of the functions of the cosmos around them, and he did all of that without ever being identified with the elements of nature. That's kind of the interesting distinction. Again, Shamash could only handle the sun, and he was co-identified with the sun. But Yahweh was doing everything, and yet he was distinct from the world that he created and operated. And what's interesting too is that we find that the Israelites depicted Yahweh in language that's used elsewhere for other deities. So for instance, a lot of language of storm imagery of Yahweh being the one who brings the rain clouds to make the crops grow is actually taken from texts talking about Baal, who was an alternative god in ancient Israel that the Israelites were not supposed to worship. They took language about Baal and they applied it to Yahweh. Not because they're stealing from Baal and applying it to Yahweh, but because Yahweh is doing what Baal usually does. There's solar imagery applied to Yahweh in some texts too, taken from Egyptian sources. But Yahweh wasn't co-identifiable with Amun or Ra. Rather, he's doing what those solar deities do. He's carrying out the functions of things that would ordinarily take a whole pantheon to do. So when we see language used to depict Yahweh in ancient Israelite texts that's taken from other cultures, they're not trying to disguise Baal and Ra as Yahweh or vice versa. Rather, they're clothing Yahweh with the accoutrements of the various gods who carried out the various functions of the cosmos around them. And I think that's really cool to see. And it's also really cool to see the symbolism of Yahweh developing over time, because again, depending on which phase in Israel's history you're in, some things are going to be more important than others. Most of the agrarian metaphors, or the agricultural metaphors that we find, are when Israel was in the land and they're growing crops. So of course they're going to depict God that way. But in the oldest texts of Israel, which probably date to the time when they were still sort of wandering around somewhat aimlessly on the Sinai Peninsula or in southern Canaan, we see basically no agricultural metaphors at all. But there's tons of metaphors talking about rocks and clouds and fire and things that you would encounter in the wild itself. So the imagery evolves as the people saw different functions as being more important to them in different phases of history. I keep going back to agriculture, but that's just one of many. It's super cool to see that in the oldest materials, like the poems embedded in the Pentateuch, you see a sort of different set of clothing items, shall we say, associated with God. And God changes his clothes into a more agrarian manner as the Israelites became more and more agriculturally inclined. And that continues as well into the exilic period and further onwards. So whatever the Israelites found important is the symbolism that they attached to God at the time, and I think that's really cool. But if there is one unifying element, one sort of universal symbol that identifies Yahweh and identifies his relationship with his people, it's that Yahweh is the God of the covenant. Now, covenants in general and the covenant of God with Israel in particular are deserving of their own discussion, but suffice it to say here that God's core identity in the mind of the Israelites was that he's the God of the covenant. A covenant, for anybody who doesn't know, is basically a formalized relationship. It can be as simple as two people entering into a business relationship and being like, hey, let's commonly agree that we can both use this well. We have a covenant agreement between the two of us. Everything's good. Or it can be as complicated as what's called a suzerain vassal treaty, which is where the king of one kingdom, who's stronger than another king, says, hey, you're my vassal now. You'll continue to rule over your territory, but I'm really in charge here. I'm the suzerain, you're my vassal. And there's benefits involved with that as well. You know, like if you need military support, I'll give that to you, but I'm also going to exact taxes from you. That's another example of a covenant. And God is known as being the one who made a covenant with Israel. In fact, the covenant that he made with Israel is best understood as a suzerain vassal treaty. That's to say, Israel was its own autonomous nation, but God was their high king. They could have a king on the throne, but the king on the throne was the vassal to Yahweh himself. And this is the relationship that God identifies with his people. The covenant is laid out specifically in the Law of Moses itself. And after the Law of Moses was composed, Moses makes sure that all the Israelites undergo the initiation ceremony into the covenant with God. And the terms and conditions of that covenant are what's contained in the Torah itself. It's the Law of Moses that one has to keep in order to obey the terms and conditions of God's covenant. Essentially, it's a contract of the relationship between God and his people. And it was the obedience to this covenant and entering into this covenant relationship that established the relationship between the Israelites and their God. And this was actually really weird, and it was in contradistinction to the way that the other nations around them thought of their gods. The overarching philosophy of how the ancients looked at the gods is defined by John Walton as the Great Symbiosis. Walton identifies the Great Symbiosis in primarily the sacrificial system of the ancients, although it pervades all of their thinking. Essentially, the ancients were of the opinion that the gods needed humans as much as the humans needed the gods. So essentially, the gods need feeding, the gods need watering, the gods need clothing, the gods need housing. Whatever human beings need, the gods must need as well. And so the ancients built temples for the gods as their houses. They built idols for them that they can clothe with ceremonial clothing to clothe the gods. They made sacrifices to them to feed the gods. And the belief was that if the gods were being fed, if they were being taken care of, they would continue to carry out their operations in the cosmos. Think about it. Shamash is up there trying to move the sun through the sky. He's going to get hungry. He's going to get tired. And if he has to go off and look for food, the sun might not come up again on the right time. Or in Egypt, if Osiris isn't properly placated, maybe the Nile won't rise as it usually does every year and bring with it that fertilizing soil. So the gods needed humans to take care of them just as much as humans needed the gods to take care of them. And in return for humans taking care of the gods made sure that the cosmos functioned properly and made sure that the things that the humans needed continued to take place. Humans can't feed the gods if they can't grow grain, and so everybody benefits from it. It's a codependent, mutually beneficial relationship. But the covenant challenges that, because the covenant isn't predicated on something that the Israelites can give to God. It's predicated on the fact that God has willingly chosen to reveal himself to a select group of people to dwell in their midst, and that one day the whole world would come to know who the God of Israel is and come into relationship with him. And again, a lot of the trouble that we see the Israelites getting into in the Old Testament passages and the parts that are critical of the Israelites is that they shifted from a covenant mindset to a great symbiosis mindset. They convinced themselves, because it was so pervasive in the culture around them, that God needs them just as much as they need God. Jeremiah 7 is a great example of this. The Israelites who are standing in the temple are saying, Yahweh's not going to do anything to punish us even though we're wicked because we have the temple. We keep the temple running. It's operational. We're making sacrifices. God is being fed. We're keeping it clean. God has a place to live. Why would he shut us down for having a little bit of fun? And Jeremiah steps in to remind them that God does not think like the gods of the nation does. God expects a moral and an ethical imperative to be followed by his people, at least a little bit, guys. Come on. And he isn't reliant on the great symbiosis. And again, it's in passages like these where God reminds the people, like, do you think that I need you to feed me? Like, the sacrifices are there for your sake, not for mine. And so, because this was such a pervasive way of thinking in the ancient world, more and more people started to think like this. And when the great symbiosis philosophy starts to replace the covenant philosophy is usually when we see the Israelites start slipping away from obeying the covenant altogether. There is a lot more to be said about Yahweh, and I have several other projects in the work that are going to explicate those interesting ideas a little bit more. But let's conclude with this. Yahweh is the God of ancient Israel. He's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's the God of Moses and David and the prophets. He's the God of Jesus Christ, and he's my God and the God of all Christians today. Although Yahweh was depicted in a variety of different ways in the ancient world by the ancient Israelites, nevertheless there are several important through lines, primarily God's faithfulness to his covenant that continue from the very beginning all the way until, not even the New Testament, but until present day for believers. Now that covenant relationship has changed a little bit. There's the covenant of Moses and there's the new covenant with the blood of Jesus Christ. And so the relationship with God looks a little bit different for us than it did for the ancient Israelites back then. But let's remember that this is the same God that we're worshiping today who was worshipped by them back then. God hasn't changed, but people have. Anyways, if you've stuck around this long, I really hope that you found this video entertaining or at the very least a little bit interesting. I hope it didn't sound too preachy throughout the whole thing, but I am trying to make some connections between ancient religion and modern religion so we can kind of see where some of the through lines are and not just nerd out about cool stuff that's nevertheless very idiosyncratic. I've got some more videos in the same vein as this one that are going to be coming out soon, but I also want to take a break from focusing too heavily on the theological aspects so we can take a look at some ancient books of the Bible, lost gospels, things of that nature, and kind of return to a little bit more plurality. But if anybody has ideas for some other topics they'd like to see, whether it's a book from the ancient world, some ancient literature, or if it's a concept from the ancient world, let me know in the comments below. I'm really interested in hearing what you guys are interested in learning more about. I'm always looking for suggestions. So anyways, thanks so much for sticking around. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you all next time.